All right, I have the privilege of talking about Rowland Bingham. And I had never heard of him before. In fact, when you Google him, you won't really find a lot of information about him. However, he started one of the most successful mission organizations in the world, which is known as SIM. And originally, it started out as SIM because it stood for the Sudan Interior Mission. And now it has been changed to Serving in Missions. And Roland has a really personal connection with me because when I was on my internship in Uganda, on my Uganda national team, I read his book when I was out in the bush living in a tent all by myself with my just the Ugandans. And it really was encouraging to read his life story and some of the things that he encountered, like when him and his 3 colleagues first arrived in Africa, they decided that to save money, they weren't going to have meat or any of the fancy food, and they were going to only eat the porridge. And one of the things in the book was his stomach rivaled and demented and hated the fact of this gruel. And I was like, I had that this morning. I know what he's feeling. And fast forward 7 years to when Bethany and I were in Malawi. His story helped encourage me when I was on the field. And then the last 6 months that Bethany and I were in Malawi, an SIM doctor helped Bethany and I make it through the last 7 months by encouraging me. He was Dr. Barrett Jones, and he and his wife serve with SIM. And one of our close friend of Team Missions, Dr. Diane Young, who has helped many of the Team Missions interns and national staff in Malawi. She's been in Malawi for 12 years. She's from New Zealand, and she's done a lot of work, helped our interns medically. She's also with SIM. And so the work of this man has even impacted Team Missions. So Roland was born in the UK on December 19th, 1872. And at the age of 16, he moved to Canada. And he became saved at a Salvation Army meeting in the UK. And then when he immigrated to Canada, how many of you have ever had an older lady in your life, maybe a Sunday school teacher or someone in your church who has kind of directed you in ministry? Anyone? That was Roland. Mrs. Gowers invited him after church one day and showed him a picture of her daughter. And she said, my daughter is serving in China as a missionary. And then she gave him a picture of his son and said, how much do you know about the interior of Africa? And he goes, well, not much. And she said, she started to explain to him the need for missionaries, not just off the coast of Africa, because the whole coast of Africa, down through Nigeria, Libya, Liberia, South Africa, had all been settled, and there were tons of missionaries. But nobody was willing to venture inside the interior because everyone that did ended up becoming either dinner for cannibals or they died of malaria before they even reached the interior. And so Roland met up with Mrs. Gower's son, and they decided to adventure to the interior. And I'm just going to read bits and pieces from the book about how he got there. Nearly 5 months later, on November 4th, 1893, Walter Gowans, Tom Kent, and Rowland Bingham stood on the deck of the ship, watching the coastline of England slip away. They were finally on their way to Africa. Although it had been a wonderful moment for Roland, he was filled with conflicting thoughts. For one thing, he had not been able to find a single missionary board in Great Britain that would be willing to take them on. In fact, nobody was even interested in going into the inside of the interior. Without a mission board behind them, the men had no one but Mrs. Gowers to keep the church updated on their news and prayer requests. Roland smiled to himself. If we have a one-woman missionary board, there is no woman I would rather have behind me than Mrs. Gowan. He thought she has enough enthusiasm and vision to do the work of 10 others. Because the men had not found a mission board in England willing to take them on, Walter had come up with the name for the 3 of them. They would call themselves the Sudan Interior Mission, SIM for short, and Walter's mother would be their entire mission board. Wouldn't be hard to get things past there, huh? Roland liked the name. It had no nonsense ring to it. The men were grateful that individual Christians had given them enough money to pay for all their passage from Liverpool to Lagos, West Africa, and they still had 150 pounds with to journey to Lagos inland to Sudan. So the men traveled. They were so excited. They get to the port, and of course, it's all the smells, the sights, the heat, and they get settled into a place to stay, and they get called by a Methodist missionary. And the Methodist missionary calls them and they say, you know, we're so excited to go to the interior. And he looks at them and says, you will never see the interior. In fact, you're foolish for going. And he said, just wait. Within the next couple of days, one of you is going to come down with malaria. And sure enough, not even 3 weeks into Africa, Roland came down with a severe case of malaria. So much to the fact that he was not able to travel into the interior with the other 2 men. So he decided that he would stay in town and the other 2 would venture into the interior. And within a couple of weeks, both of them had died. And so Roland returned to Canada to talk to Mrs. Gowers, who was so excited about them going. And they decided that Roland would not return to Canada, would not return to England, would not return to Africa, but he instead would try to recruit missionaries to go. And Roland's life kind of became where he actually never eventually went and lived in Africa ever again. He went to visit, but for the rest of his life, his primary focus was being the sender. And so he and his wife were the ones who trained and sent missionaries to go over. And so we're going to fast forward, and this chapter is titled 1 Step Forward and 2 Steps Back. On January 11th, 1990, Roland and 2 missionaries set out for Africa. It had been over a little 6 years since Roland had made the same journey with Walter Gowers and Tom Kent before he left. Roland paid a visit to Mrs. Gowers, who wished him well and offered her full support for the mission, promising to pray for them every day. After the ship reached Liverpool, England on January 27th, Roland enjoyed a reunion with his family. His mother was still in health, and most of his brothers were married and had children of their own. His sister Winifred was still single, however very interested in Christian mission. Roland encouraged her to be the prayer link for the SIM chain in England. A month later, on February 27th, the group sailed from Liverpool to Lagos on a journey that took them 3 weeks. As he had done on the earlier ship with Walter and Tom, Roland found a place to rent, and he and James and Peter moved in. Once settled in the house, it did not take long for Roland to realize that missionaries in Lagos were even more opposed to their planned mission than they were 6 years ago. They tried to discourage James and Peter with stories of hardship they would encounter if they ventured into the interior, not to mention the number of circumstances of those missionaries who had died in the process. Roland did his best to encourage the young men as he made plans to journey inland with them. But 3 weeks after he arrived in Lagos, Roland once again came down with malaria. So you have this guy, he's all excited, he gets people to go, and after 6 years of recruiting people in Canada, he finally has 2 people to go with him. He gets there, and all the other missionaries are like, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't listen to your boss, he's crazy. And then before you know it, he falls down with malaria. So again, he had to stay in town. As they left him feverish and sweating on his bunk, James and Peter promised Roland that they would stay in Africa and carry out the work of SIM. Roland was confident they would. After all, they had already spent 6 months in Tripoli learning the language and getting used to African culture. As the ship sailed away from Lagos, Roland felt defeated. In fact, he had never felt so low in his life. Yet he clung to the hope that James and Peter would succeed in their mission. They were better equipped for Africa than he and Walter ever were. By the time the ship reached Plymouth, England on April 27, 1900, Roland was feeling much better. The attention of the doctor on board plus the cool sea breeze had worked wonders. Roland looked forward to the news from Lagos, and as he made his way to London to pick up the mail, he found a telegram waiting for him. The words on it turned his blood cold. "Following you home. Work impossible. Need advice. Goodbye." For a brief moment, Roland wondered whether it would be easier to die in Africa than to have to read the message to the board. He could hardly bear to think about the opportunities two young men had missed and the setback that it would be in the incredible credibility of SIM. So far, the mission had not managed to keep a single missionary on the field. Roland went back to the board of SIM, and this part is kind of interesting. After the finally, the moment Rowland Bingham dreaded arrived. He was standing before the board of SIM in Toronto, explaining why the latest missionary attempt had ended in complete failure. None of the men on the board said anything unkind, but they did not say anything encouraging either, except for one man, Bill Henson. After the meeting ended, Bill sought to encourage Roland. "Don't give up," he said. "God will give you a breakthrough if you stay true to your calling." Roland took Bill's words to heart and determined to go. He continued to speak in churches and public meetings, raising awareness and funds for the Sudan Interior Mission. In the meantime, the Bingham family managed to live on $10 a month, hardly enough to pay rent. One of the stories was they had gotten to a place where they had no food in the house except 1 cup of milk and a small plate of butter. And he looked at his wife and said, "Well, what are we going to do with that?" And she goes, "Well, God will provide." And they gave their child the milk, and he went to bed. And she went down to put the butter in the fridge. And who they were renting from said, "Hey, they owned a little grocery store. Somebody dropped off a loaf of rye bread, and I want you and Roland to have it." And Roland said that he and his wife never went hungry. Roland began to become more successful. As the years went on, more missionaries signed up, and soon they finally had little breakthroughs here and there. At one point, a family, 3 couples went, and they actually were able to finally establish the first ever SIM mission station, and those people ended up staying in the Southern Interior for over 20 years. And when Roland went back 20 years later, the church had grown to 15,000 people. Turning of the tide. The years rolled by and the work of the Sudan Interior Mission began to grow. Andrew Stirrup provided the well-suited life in Africa. He was a tireless worker whose stamina amazed the younger missionaries, and the 2 missionaries were now serving with the SIM mission in Nigeria. The first was Tommy, a short man with a little formal education. When Roland had asked him what he would do if SIM turned him down, he replied, "I'll find a board to send me, even if it's a washboard." Eventually, in 1908, the board of SIM did send out Tommy, who went straight to work among the Yagaba people in the town of Egbe. The other man SIM sent out was a well-known Canadian athlete by the name of God Playfield. Guy had attended Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and then left straight away for Sudan. In addition, an SIM office had been set up in England to recruit support missionaries from that country. Roland's sister oversaw the work there. And as you read his life, you'll notice there's a lot of moments where not a lot of exciting things were happening. The book will even say, like, years have gone by, but you slowly see the ministry growing. And as the years go by, he starts meeting with other people from around the world who are like, "We want to join SIM, but we live in Australia or we live in New Zealand." And so Roland said, people from Australia and New Zealand, they should be missionaries on the east side of Africa because then they don't have to travel around the Cape. And so he sent somebody to New Zealand to set up an office in New Zealand. He sent somebody to Australia to set up an office in Australia. And what's cool about SIM is all of their offices work independently of each other. So SIM New Zealand has their missionaries, SIM Australia has theirs, SIM Canada, but they all work together, but they have their own separate entities. Roland and his wife are kind of a jack of all trades. If a missionary was starting to fall apart, they seemed to take it on. And so around the turn of the century, they became in charge of a huge missions conference in Canada called the Kent Conference, and they oversaw that. And then a man who was running a Christian press said, Roland, I can't keep the press going any longer. And Roland decided to take over the press. This is a neat story of when Roland went back to Africa after so many years and found that many of the places where he'd hoped to go, the church had expanded. What a difference years had made. The missionaries that had gone after Roland were excited for Roland to come back and see the progress. They also apologized. If you had been here this morning, they said, you would have found 1,500 other Christians to preach to. However, at night they go out into hundreds of different villages on their own and run their own revival services. Roland was astonished at the number of Christians who attended the church. When he had visited the Tangle with, it's not Tangle, I don't know how to pronounce it, with Andrew 15 years before, they had been warned that it was a life-threatening to go among these people. Now the Tangle had held their arms to welcome him. Roland was not sure what message he should preach that night. So he asked John, what should I speak about? Anything you would speak about at your own service. They have the whole Old and New Testament in their own language, and they've been studying it on their own. At the end of the service, the congregation insisted on taking up an offering to further missionary work, and the entire church gave $65. We're talking about a small African village that grew and was now taking up an offering to further God's kingdom in other parts of Africa, which I thought was really cool. Roland and his wife continued to be the senders, and by the time of his death, there were over 360 missionaries serving on the field with SIM, and SIM's budget in 1940 was over $400,000 per year, which was a lot of money. Roland was planning on one last journey to Africa before his death, and he was this time going to take an airplane. And a week before he was supposed to leave, he had a stroke and passed away. This was something that was written at his funeral. And it says, and so for the first time we face a new year without him. Throughout this worldwide ministry, for he visited many lands, it was ever his joy to speak God's great heroes, exhorting us to imitate their faith. And now that he too has joined that great cloud of witness, we say to one another with a new meaning as we remember him. A few days later, after Rowland Bingham's funeral, the 360 SIM workers in Africa received their leader's annual Christmas newsletter, which Roland had written and mailed out days just before he passed away. Many of those who received the newsletter broke down and wept as they read Roland's final message to them. Among them was Andrew, who at the age of 77 years of age still preached every day in the remote marketplace of Haju, or however you say it. I don't know how. Roland's life was resounds a lot for me and Bethany now that we're no longer on the front lines and we're here training people. It's exciting that even great missionaries of the past, sometimes they were called to be the senders.